In the medieval world, beauty was a peculiar and often dangerous gift, especially for women. While today, society might celebrate a pretty face or a striking appearance, in medieval times, the very notion of beauty was complex, sometimes idolized, but at other times feared. You see, in the medieval period, looking too good often meant more than just vanity or admiration. It could bring about unwanted attention, envy, and even danger. Beauty was so intertwined with social expectations, religion, and politics that a woman's appearance could easily decide her fate, often in the most perilous ways. If you were a woman blessed with natural beauty, people might see you as a symbol of divine favor. But at the same time, others might see your beauty as a threat to their status or power. It wasn't just about looking good. It was about the complex web of perception. And in some cases, this web could ensnare you. Now, imagine yourself in the shoes of a beautiful woman in medieval Europe. You might think being admired for your appearance would be flattering, but beauty could also make you a target. People might envy you, plot against you, or even accuse you of being something far worse than just another pretty face. In fact, beauty in the medieval world was so powerful that it often sparked fear. Fear of your influence, fear of your charm, and fear that you might be using your appearance for more than just aesthetic purposes. This wasn't just a shallow concern. It was rooted in superstition, religion, and the political dynamics of the time. Historians still debate whether the medieval obsession with women's beauty was merely a reflection of the period's societal norms, or if it stemmed from deeper fears about women's influence on men and society. Some argue that beauty was a symbol of innocence and purity, while others insist it was a dangerous weapon that women wielded to their advantage. Either way, the reality was clear. Too much beauty could be seen as a threat. As you settle further into the story, you can almost picture the medieval world around you. Castles stand tall with their cold stone walls, and the air is thick with the hum of everyday life. People working, talking, and going about their business. But amid all of this, one thing is clear. Beauty, especially in women, wasn't just a matter of personal pride. It was a political tool. Think about it. When a woman was considered too beautiful in medieval times, she wasn't just drawing the eyes of men or receiving compliments from other women. No. Her beauty was seen as something much more powerful, and with that power came dangers beyond envy. One of the most visible threats was the possibility of being accused of witchcraft. Yes, that's right. Beautiful women were often associated with the supernatural, with forces that were beyond human understanding. It might sound like something out of a dark fairy tale, but in the medieval world, the line between beauty and witchcraft was often dangerously thin. A woman who was considered extraordinarily beautiful could easily be seen as a temptress or, worse, someone who had made a pact with dark forces. Her physical beauty became a symbol of danger to those who couldn't quite understand or control it. But it didn't stop there. This association with witchcraft wasn't just about suspicion. It often led to very real consequences. Women who were too beautiful, especially those who stood out in a crowd, could be accused of using their looks to manipulate or control others. Whether it was influencing the king, causing political unrest, or tempting the good men of the village into committing sins. A beautiful woman was seen as a power that could not be trusted. And once the accusations started flying, they were almost impossible to stop. Historians still argue whether these accusations were a product of medieval superstition, or if they were more about controlling women's power and influence in a male-dominated society. Some claim that it was the church's influence that made beauty seem dangerous, while others suggest that the fear of powerful women was what really drove these accusations. What is certain, however, is that a woman's beauty could easily become a weapon, but one that was just as likely to get her killed as it was to elevate her status. As you lie back and imagine this world, where beauty can be a dangerous weapon, it's hard not to wonder about the pressures that women in medieval society faced. It wasn't just about being beautiful. It was about surviving and navigating the complicated web of social norms, religious beliefs, and power dynamics. While some women worked tirelessly to perfect their appearance, others found themselves under the weight of society's expectations and suspicions. The medieval world didn't just judge a woman on her looks. It judged her on what those looks represented. In fact, one of the key ways in which beauty was seen as dangerous was through the concept of the temptress. The term itself is laden with the notion that beauty was not simply a gift. It was something that could be used to manipulate and control. The most famous examples, such as the legendary figures of medieval lore, show just how quickly a beautiful woman could become the villain in a story. Whether it was Delilah bringing down Samson or the countless stories of women leading men astray, beauty often held a moral implication. It wasn't just about outward appearance. It was seen as a reflection of inner character. And in the eyes of medieval society, beauty often suggested a level of danger and moral ambiguity. But the danger wasn't just in how society perceived beauty. It was in how it could become a form of social control. A woman's beauty could easily be seen as a challenge to the existing power structures, especially when those in power were threatened by what they couldn't control. For noble women, beauty was expected, but it also came with responsibility. It was their job to not just look good, but to marry well, bear children, and uphold the family's honor. But when a woman's beauty seemed too powerful or threatened the balance of power, the consequences could be severe. In the worst cases, it could lead to exile, imprisonment, or even execution. This fear of powerful beauty wasn't confined to the nobility. For peasant women, who often worked the land under the harshest of conditions, beauty was still a matter of life and death. However, for them, the threat was more practical than spiritual. Their beauty could make them vulnerable to exploitation, both physically and emotionally. A beautiful peasant woman might be seen as an asset, a valuable prize, to be traded between men, or worse, used as leverage in local power struggles. In these situations, beauty wasn't just dangerous. It was a way of being targeted and used by others for their own gain. Historians still debate whether these ideals of beauty as dangerous were actually reflective of the social order, or if they were simply a way for men to exert control over women's power. Some believe that beauty, in this sense, was a kind of currency for women, something they could use to gain influence, if they knew how to wield it. Others suggest that this view of beauty as dangerous was designed to limit women's freedom and keep them confined to certain roles within society. Regardless, one thing is clear. In medieval times, beauty was as much about survival as it was about appearance, and too much of it could easily become a threat to both a woman's life and her reputation. Now, as you continue to drift into the rhythms of the past, consider the fascinating paradox of beauty in the medieval world. It could be both a gift and a curse, an asset and a liability. But it wasn't just the physical traits that were scrutinized. It was also how those traits were presented. The power of beauty was amplified or diminished by the way it was used. Which brings us to the intriguing role of cosmetics. These were not the simple beauty products we know today, easily available at your local store. Instead, medieval cosmetics were often concoctions of strange and sometimes dangerous ingredients, concocted to achieve the ideal look and, sometimes, to protect the user from the dangers of beauty itself. Consider the world of medieval cosmetics. A landscape where face powders and potions were made from all sorts of odd materials, some of which were toxic. In fact, one of the most popular ways to achieve pale skin, a key beauty standard at the time, was to use lead-based face powder. This toxic concoction, often applied in thick layers, was prized for its ability to give the skin a luminous white appearance. Women of high status would often apply this powder in abundance, believing that the paler their skin, the more refined and noble they appeared. Yet, as we know now, the use of lead-based cosmetics often led to severe health issues, such as poisoning, hair loss, and even death. So, while these women believed they were enhancing their beauty, they were unwittingly poisoning themselves in the process. The irony, of course, is that their desire for beauty ultimately became their undoing. In addition to face powders, other cosmetic products were often crafted from highly volatile or obscure ingredients. Honey, for instance, was a common ingredient in many medieval beauty treatments, as it was believed to moisturize the skin. But honey could also attract dirt and cause infections when used improperly. Despite its dangers, honey remained popular, and it was incorporated into a variety of creams, ointments, and even bathing rituals. Some beauty routines involved mixing honey with milk, creating a concoction that would hydrate and cleanse the skin, though its benefits were likely overstated. But, with the passage of time, honey's spiritual and healing properties became part of the mythology surrounding beauty. It wasn't just about looking good. It was about aligning oneself with ancient traditions and powers, seeking the favor of the gods, and attempting to transcend mortality through these earthly rituals. Historians still argue whether women in medieval times understood the true dangers of these beauty practices. Some suggest they were fully aware of the risks they took in pursuit of beauty, while others believe that these rituals were part of a larger cultural system that placed beauty on a pedestal, equating it with spiritual purity and divine favor, regardless of the intent. The fact remains that the medieval obsession with beauty often led to dangerous practices that could, at times, cause more harm than good. Beauty became a tightrope walk. Too much of it, and it could be perceived as a dangerous weapon. Too little, and one could fall into obscurity. While the lead poisoning, the dangerous concoctions, and the deathly beauty standards might seem like relics of the past, they were deeply tied to the structures of power, social class, and gender. It was not just about vanity. It was about maintaining status and ensuring survival in a world where physical appearance could shape everything, from personal relationships to political power. Women had to navigate this tricky terrain, walking a fine line between self-presentation and self-destruction. But, interestingly, some women found ways to exploit their beauty, not just for personal gain, but as a subtle form of rebellion against the strict societal norms that governed them. As you imagine these medieval beauty rituals in practice, picture the scenes. Women carefully applying their powders in the glow of flickering candles, their faces illuminated by firelight, their hands steady despite the knowledge that each stroke could make them more beautiful, but also more vulnerable. The scent of exotic oils and powders fills the air. While outside, the harsh realities of medieval life continue unabated. The quiet contrast between the beauty routines and the dangers that lurked beneath them speaks to the complexity of medieval beauty standards. A world where appearance was not merely about vanity, but about power, survival, and the eternal quest for transcendence. Now, let's zoom out a little and think about the broader context of beauty in medieval society. To be beautiful wasn't just about looking attractive. It was a form of social currency, especially for women. If you were a noblewoman, your beauty could make or break your marriage prospects, your alliances, and even your status in court. But it wasn't always that simple. Too much beauty could lead to jealousy, suspicion, and even dangerous consequences. In a society where everyone was constantly observing and judging, being too pretty could often attract the wrong kind of attention. Take, for example, the concept of beauty as a commodity during the Middle Ages. In a world where marriages were often arranged for political reasons, beauty was a key factor in determining a woman's value. If you were deemed beautiful, you were more likely to be sought after by suitors. But this could also make you a target. The more beautiful you were, the more you risked being objectified or even manipulated. It wasn't just about pleasing your husband or king. It was about how the whole court viewed you. And, for many women, this intense scrutiny came with a lot of pressure. Historically, many women in medieval times were objectified to the point where their beauty was considered their most important asset. If they were lucky, beauty could serve as a stepping stone to influence and power. But for others, it became a double-edged sword. Too much beauty could make you a target for envy, rumors, and even intrigue. In a time when a woman's worth was often measured by her physical appearance, her beauty could quickly become something that was seen as a threat or a distraction. You could be blamed for causing tension at court, or worse, seen as a threat to other women vying for power. To be too pretty was dangerous, not just for your reputation, but for your safety. One such example is the infamous history of Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose beauty was renowned across Europe. Known for her charm and stunning appearance, Eleanor's looks were part of what made her one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages. But her beauty wasn't without its challenges. Her marriages to the kings of both France and England were marked by political upheaval. And some historians argue that her beauty played a role in the tensions that surrounded her. Eleanor's beauty was celebrated, but it also brought jealousy from other court figures and competitors who saw her beauty as a weapon that could sway alliances. Historians still debate whether Eleanor used her beauty as a conscious tool for political advantage, or whether she was simply the subject of a society that valued her appearance as much as her intellect and power. Did she knowingly manipulate her appearance and charm to her advantage? Or was her beauty merely a result of the time and place she lived in? Some argue that her beauty wasn't just an asset. It was a tool, a way to secure her place in a male-dominated world. Others suggest that Eleanor, like many women of her time, was a victim of the beauty standards imposed upon her. Yet, beauty also had a more spiritual dimension. In the Middle Ages, being too pretty could also be seen as a sign of pride or vanity, both of which were considered sinful. The Church, with its deeply ingrained belief that humility and piety were virtuous, didn't look too kindly on women who flaunted their beauty. Women who took too much pride in their looks or wore elaborate clothing could be viewed with suspicion. The Bible and religious texts were full of warnings against vanity, and medieval Christians were often reminded that the physical world was transient. A focus on outer beauty some believed, would detract from the more important spiritual beauty that one should cultivate. As a result, women had to walk a delicate balance. Their beauty could either be seen as a reflection of God's creation or as a sign of worldly vanity. The more they adorned themselves with beauty, the more they risked being seen as too self-indulgent or even sinful. In extreme cases, women's beauty could lead to accusations of witchcraft. After all, a woman who is too beautiful might be viewed as having been touched by the devil, her looks seen as something supernatural, something unnatural. Picture yourself in this medieval world, navigating the dangerous tightrope of beauty. Women had to weigh the risks and rewards, balancing the allure of physical appearance with the moral and spiritual consequences of flaunting it. One moment you could be admired for your radiant beauty. The next, you could be the subject of whispers and rumors, facing jealousy or even punishment. Beauty, after all, wasn't just about looking good. It was an intricate part of a woman's identity, linked to her social standing, her safety, and her reputation. In some ways, the pressure of medieval beauty standards was so high that even the most privileged women couldn't escape the dangers of their appearance. The paradox was clear. Being beautiful could give you power, but it could also strip you of control. A dangerous beauty could be a double-edged sword, and many women learned to wield it carefully. Let's turn now to how the concept of beauty was intertwined with religion in medieval society. Beauty wasn't just seen as a physical trait. It was often perceived as a divine gift. For women, their appearance could either reflect divine favor or indicate moral purity. The Church, which held such sway over daily life, deeply influenced how beauty was understood. Women who were considered physically beautiful could be seen as reflections of God's creation. But they were also under the scrutiny of a society that placed immense value on modesty and piety. In a time when the Church was the moral compass of society, the virtues of humility, chastity, and self-restraint were highly prized, especially for women. Women who were too beautiful, or who took too much pride in their appearance, risked being seen as vain or worldly, virtues that were deeply at odds with Christian ideals. This view created a paradox where a woman's beauty could be both a gift and a curse, depending on how it was perceived. A prime example of this conflict is the story of Mary Magdalene. In the medieval period, she was often depicted as a beautiful woman whose sinful past was redeemed through her repentance. She became the subject of both admiration and disdain. Her beauty was seen as both a symbol of temptation and a marker of divine mercy. For centuries, artists depicted her as both seductive and penitential, balancing between the allure of her physical beauty and the spiritual narrative of her redemption. The image of Mary Magdalene reveals the tension between beauty and virtue in medieval Christian thought. Historians still argue whether the Church's views on beauty were inherently contradictory or whether they were an attempt to place beauty under the control of religious authority. Was the Church promoting a healthier view of beauty, one rooted in moral and spiritual dimensions, or were they simply trying to suppress female power by discrediting the value of beauty? Some scholars suggest that medieval society, under the influence of the Church, idealized spiritual beauty over physical beauty, hoping to curb the potential dangers of vanity. Others argue that these ideals were meant to limit women's power and enforce conformity to patriarchal standards. At the same time, beauty wasn't just a personal attribute, it was a tool of social control. The Church and the nobility both used beauty as a way to elevate their status. For example, the notion of beauty played a key role in the marriage negotiations of noble families. For women in the upper echelons of society, beauty could secure a favorable marriage, a strategic political move. While the church may have considered beauty to be a sign of divine grace, it was also used by aristocracy to uphold their wealth and influence. Now, imagine being a noblewoman in this environment. The church's insistence on modesty would require you to dress humbly and carry yourself with restraint. At the same time, however, your family would encourage you to embody beauty as a way to attract a suitor, ensuring your position within the social hierarchy. It was a delicate balancing act. One misstep in this precarious game of social expectations, and you could be branded as too vain, too worldly, or too indulgent. This constant tug-of-war between public expectations and personal desires likely left many women in a state of confusion. Should they nurture their beauty to please others? Or should they forsake their appearance in the name of modesty and piety? Either choice came with its own set of dangers. Too much beauty could make a woman a target for jealousy, while too little could result in a loss of potential marriage prospects or social status. It wasn't just beauty standards for women that were scrutinized in the medieval world. Men, too, were expected to maintain certain ideals. However, the standards for male beauty were generally less strict, focused more on strength, honor, and virility. For men, beauty often had more to do with military prowess or leadership than physical appearance. Yet, even male beauty had its risks. The medieval knights, for example, were often expected to be both strong and handsome, a combination that could attract the admiration of both women and other men. But for these men, beauty came with the expectation of power, leadership, and success in battle. Failures on these fronts could mean that their beauty was overlooked and their status diminished. As you picture yourself in this world of rigid beauty standards, it becomes clear that the medieval era was not kind to those who were perceived as too pretty. Beauty, for both men and women, came with layers of meaning, cultural, political, and spiritual. A woman who was too beautiful might find herself burdened by the constant attention and the pressure to conform to ideals that often had little to do with her personal desires. In a society that constantly measured worth by physical appearance, being too pretty wasn't necessarily a compliment. It was a complicated, often dangerous, asset. Now, let's step back and examine how the perception of beauty affected the personal lives of those living in medieval times. Imagine walking down the bustling cobbled streets of a medieval town, narrow lanes lined with wooden shops, market stalls, and the constant hum of chatter. Amid the noise, the question of beauty was never far from anyone's mind. For the peasants, beauty wasn't something that could easily be controlled or managed. It wasn't about cosmetics or elaborate attire, but about maintaining the basic hygiene necessary for survival. The more immaculate and refined your appearance, the higher your social status. But not everyone had access to these luxuries. For the common folk, staying clean was a matter of life and death, particularly because medieval towns were frequently plagued by diseases. In the countryside, it was no better. The harsh conditions of the farm meant that people were constantly in direct contact with dirt, dust, and the harsh elements. Those who worked outdoors were often subjected to extreme sun exposure, which made them appear tanned and rugged. While the wealthy in towns may have seen this as unattractive, to the peasants, it was simply a way of life. But in the more civilized parts of Europe, the lack of a tan was a symbol of purity and high social standing. When people looked upon you with your glowing, pale skin, They knew you didn't toil in the fields, and that meant you were more respected than the laboring masses. But even if you were among the nobility, the pursuit of beauty came with its own set of pressures. The struggle for a place in society didn't only extend to what you wore or how you styled your hair. It was also about how you carried yourself. When we think of medieval beauty standards, we often envision stiff, intricate garments and elaborate hairstyles. But for the aristocracy, the work of maintaining a desirable appearance could be exhausting. Those who spent time in the courts of kings and queens were constantly evaluated based on how well they embodied the ideals of the time. Was your face too round? Were your eyes too wide? Even the shape of your nose could determine your place in society. An overemphasis on beauty could make someone the subject of praise or ridicule. And while the common folk feared the judgment of others, the elites lived under the constant gaze of their peers. Let's take a moment to think about medieval beauty standards for men. Men, too, were expected to conform to strict ideals of beauty, especially within the higher classes. While women were expected to be delicate, graceful, and ethereal, men were expected to project power, virility, and strength. Their beauty wasn't just tied to their looks, but also to their actions. A knight, for example, needed to demonstrate physical prowess and bravery, qualities that not only reflected beauty, but also elevated a man's social standing. The more handsome and powerful a knight appeared, the more attention he would receive. However, the knight's appearance could not be separated from his actions. If he failed to live up to the ideals of a warrior through cowardice, dishonesty, or disgrace, his beauty was dismissed and his reputation tarnished. In a strange way, beauty during the medieval period was a reflection of one's moral standing. If someone appeared too attractive, they risked appearing vain or self-absorbed. In a world where vanity was a vice, some would argue that beautiful people were considered morally weak. For the wealthy or noble class, this could be disastrous. One had to walk a fine line between maintaining their beauty and not falling into the traps of pride or arrogance. It was a delicate balance. Historians still argue whether this obsession with beauty was driven by societal pressures, or if it was merely a reflection of the personal aspirations people held. Was beauty an inherent desire that spanned the social classes? Or was it simply a tool of social control, used by the nobility to maintain their status? Some suggest that beauty standards in medieval Europe were a way of reinforcing the patriarchal structure of society, ensuring that women were objectified while men were given the freedom to exist as both beautiful and powerful. Others believe that beauty was simply an expression of the human desire for self-improvement, a desire that crossed social barriers and found its place in every facet of medieval life. As you drift deeper into these thoughts, imagine that you are one of the noble women in the royal court, constantly adjusting your appearance to maintain your place among your peers. You wear your finest gown, painstakingly decorated with silk and lace. But you know that your value is not just in your clothes. It's in how you carry yourself and how others see you. When you walk through the halls of the palace, you are not just a woman. You are an image, a symbol of grace, power, and purity. Your beauty isn't just for personal indulgence. It is your role in this grand performance that society expects from you. The struggle to uphold beauty standards wasn't just confined to women. Men in the courts were equally involved in the performance of their own beauty rituals, constantly at war with the idea of being deemed too proud, too vain, or too weak. Men like knights, who sought beauty in their appearances, also had to show their valor in battle, displaying their heroic beauty not only through their external appearance but through their courage, loyalty, and strength. As we continue our journey, let's explore how the obsession with beauty during the medieval period often led people down paths of strange, sometimes dangerous, rituals and practices. Imagine the world of medieval skincare, where remedies were often a bizarre combination of herbs, animal parts, and strange substances that, in today's world, we would consider highly unorthodox or even hazardous. The idea of a beauty treatment in medieval times was far removed from the gentle facials and spa visits we think of today. Instead, it was a blend of trial, error, and superstition. Let's step into the shoes of a medieval woman, carefully preparing for an evening ball or royal gathering. In a world where first impressions could shape your entire future, beauty wasn't just something to be admired. It was something to be constructed. To achieve the pale skin that was the hallmark of nobility, women would use all kinds of toxic substances, including lead-based makeup, which was designed to give them that coveted ivory complexion. Lead toner sun, however, was no simple beauty tool. It was a deadly substance that, over time, could cause serious health problems, including lead poisoning. Yet, for many medieval women, the allure of beauty was enough to risk their health in the pursuit of perfection. At the same time, there were less dangerous, but still rather peculiar, beauty treatments that medieval men and women were known to use. For example, some people believed that washing their face with the blood of a freshly slaughtered animal could cure skin blemishes and give them a radiant glow. Others used products like vinegar, lye, and even urine as part of their beauty regimen, relying on the natural acidity and purported healing properties of these ingredients. While some of these treatments may have had practical effects, they also serve as a reminder of how far people were willing to go to meet the beauty ideals of the time, even if it meant enduring discomfort or taking a chance with their health. Historians still debate whether these dangerous beauty treatments were truly a result of ignorance or if they were part of a larger, more intentional cultural practice of maintaining a particular image. Some argue that medieval people knew the risks involved, but chose to accept them in order to conform to societal expectations. Others suggest that the lack of scientific understanding of chemistry and medicine meant that people were simply unaware of the dangers they were facing. Regardless, these bizarre practices became deeply ingrained in the culture, and they speak to the lengths people would go to in order to maintain their beauty. Think about the time and energy these people invested in their beauty routines. While some would spend hours crafting elaborate hairstyles and applying layers of cosmetics, others were working to achieve a more natural look. But no matter how they approached it, the goal was the same: to present themselves as pure, powerful, and capable of embodying the divine. Beauty, in medieval times, was a political weapon, and women in particular had to walk a delicate line. On the one hand, they were expected to maintain their beauty, to attract the attention of suitors or political allies. But on the other hand, too much attention to beauty could be viewed as vain or improper. Too much adornment, too much care for appearance, and a woman could be labeled as morally corrupt or unworthy of respect. The pursuit of beauty was a constant balancing act. When we think of the beauty standards of medieval Europe, it's important to remember that they were not just about looking good. They were about fitting into a society where external appearance was intricately tied to one's place in the social hierarchy. The wealthy and the powerful were expected to look a certain way, radiant, youthful, and untouched by the struggles of everyday life. But for the rest of society, looking beautiful often meant appearing healthy, clean, and modest, anything that could distance them from the hard labor of the lower classes. Now, as you lay there, drifting off to sleep, imagine the weight of these beauty standards on a medieval woman or man, trying to live up to the ideals of the time. What does it feel like to step into society's gaze, constantly aware of how others are assessing you? What does it take to maintain that perfect balance between virtue and vanity? Whether or not they fully understood the long-term effects of their beauty practices, people in medieval times were fully immersed in a world where appearance could determine your fate, your social mobility, and your place in the eyes of others. And in that world, being too pretty wasn't just a matter of vanity, it was a matter of survival. The pressure to conform to these standards affected everything from how people dressed to the rituals they performed. Women could not afford to appear too plain or too decorated. If they did, they risked being ignored or dismissed, or worse, labeled as immoral. And the men, too, were bound by their own set of rules. Strength and power were intertwined with beauty in the medieval world. And the most respected and feared knights were often seen as handsome and physically imposing. Their appearance not only reflected their status, but also their character and worthiness in the eyes of others. Now, let's focus on the symbolism behind medieval beauty ideals and how they were deeply intertwined with religion and spirituality. In a world dominated by the church and religious teachings, beauty wasn't merely a superficial matter. It was often seen as a reflection of divine favor. The most beautiful individuals were often perceived as closer to the divine, their physical appearance seen as a sign of purity and goodness. Think about it. To be considered beautiful was to be considered virtuous, a reflection of moral and spiritual alignment. In a time when the line between the physical and the spiritual was so blurred, beauty became more than skin deep. It became a symbol of divine grace. The church, in particular, had a massive influence on how beauty was perceived in medieval times. Saints, angels, and even the Virgin Mary were often depicted with flawless, radiant features, an idealized standard that medieval people aspired to emulate. This connection between beauty and divine virtue reinforced the idea that appearance had a direct link to one's spiritual and moral worth. If a person appeared beautiful, they were often assumed to be virtuous, while those who didn't meet the ideal of beauty might be judged as morally suspect or less favored by God. This notion is a fascinating blend of aesthetics and theology, where beauty wasn't just a matter of looking good. It was about reflecting God's creation and favor. Yet, in this world, beauty standards were not just for women. Men, too, had their own set of standards they had to uphold. Knights, for example, were expected to look strong and noble, embodying the ideals of chivalry. Their appearance, how they dressed, groomed, and even carried themselves, was deeply tied to their reputation as warriors and protectors. Handsomeness in a knight was not just an attribute of physical beauty, but one that symbolized their readiness for battle, their honor, and their divine favor. The pressure on men to maintain this appearance was just as intense, though it was framed differently than the expectations for women. Where women were expected to maintain youth and delicacy, men had to project strength, courage, and fearlessness. But for women, beauty often had a much more complex and subtle meaning. A beautiful woman wasn't just admired, she was scrutinized. Her beauty was seen as an indicator of her moral and social standing. Women who embodied the physical ideal of beauty were often seen as embodying the very best of womanhood, virginal, pure, and worthy of respect. A beautiful woman, therefore, wasn't just a pleasure to the eyes. She was a symbol of the ideal Christian woman. And as a result, her beauty became a reflection of her relationship with God. To be deemed beautiful in medieval society often meant that a woman had managed to perfect the delicate balance of being pious and virtuous, while also being admired and desired. Still, there was a shadow side to this. If a woman didn't meet the beauty ideal, or worse, if she was deemed too beautiful, she could face suspicion and even scandal. As history has shown, when a woman's beauty was considered overwhelming or threatening, she could quickly become the subject of jealousy, rumors, and even witchcraft accusations. Think of how many legends and stories centered around a beautiful woman who turned out to be a dangerous seductress, a temptress leading men to their doom. These perceptions were no accident. They were deeply tied to societal fears of female power, especially when that power was rooted in beauty, in a time when women had little power over their own lives. Their beauty could become both a gift and a curse. So, imagine for a moment the weight on the shoulders of a medieval woman who possessed this idealized beauty. On one hand, she could be admired and respected, the object of attention in royal courts and social gatherings. On the other hand, she had to walk a fine line, constantly aware of how her appearance was perceived by others. To be beautiful in medieval times was not always a blessing. It could be a burden, one that tied a woman's worth to her looks and made her vulnerable to the shifting opinions of society. In the minds of the people, beauty was a reflection of much more than just outward appearance. It was a direct link to their moral and spiritual standing. And so, as the pressure to conform to these ideals mounted, people went to incredible lengths to achieve the perfect appearance. They turned to cosmetics, clothing, and even spiritual practices, all in an attempt to align themselves with the divine. Some might have used cosmetics to lighten their skin. Some might have adorned themselves with jewelry to reflect their status. And others might have spent hours praying, hoping that their beauty would reflect their piety. Historians still argue whether these medieval beauty standards were truly ingrained in society, or whether they were more of a product of the elites trying to maintain their position in the hierarchy. Was beauty truly a divine gift? Or was it an illusion created by those who wished to control the narrative? Some argue that beauty standards were a form of social control, a way to ensure that people were aware of their place in the social order. Others believe that medieval people truly saw beauty as a spiritual pursuit, one that could bring them closer to the divine. Regardless of the motivation behind these beauty ideals, they were a powerful force in medieval society. Beauty wasn't just about looking good. It was about power, status, and the ability to navigate the complex web of social and religious expectations that defined the medieval world. As we continue, let's explore how beauty standards in medieval times were not just dictated by the elites, but were also deeply intertwined with the economic realities of the time. In a world where survival was often uncertain, and where a person's appearance could influence their prospects for marriage, work, or social standing, beauty standards were incredibly important. And this wasn't just about appearance. It was about the kind of work you did, where you came from, and how you lived. It was, in many ways, a reflection of social class. Consider the peasants, who lived in harsh conditions, working the land and performing strenuous labor. For them, looking beautiful wasn't about adhering to the latest trends in royal courts or attempting to achieve a pale complexion that symbolized wealth and leisure. In fact, the very notion of beauty for the lower classes was a stark contrast to that of the nobility. The peasants, by virtue of their labor in the fields, developed a tanned complexion that was deemed unsightly by the standards of nobility, who sought to keep their pale, delicate skin out of the sun to protect their appearance. For the peasants, beauty was more practical. Cleanliness and basic grooming were vital to avoiding the diseases and infections that were rampant at the time. And yet, despite the roughness of their daily lives, the peasants were still bound by societal expectations. If a woman had a rough, tanned complexion and was unable to afford the luxury of cosmetics or beauty treatments, her prospects for marriage might be diminished. Beauty, even in the most humble of circumstances, still had economic consequences. Those who were deemed unattractive often faced social exclusion. And in a society where marriage was one of the few paths to financial security, this could be a significant blow. But for the upper classes, beauty was a much more elaborate affair. Nobles and royals had access to the finest luxury goods and cosmetics of the time, often imported from distant lands. Exotic perfumes, expensive fabrics, and the finest soaps and oils were all part of the beauty regimen of the medieval elite. The wealthier you were, the more you could afford to spend on your appearance. The richer, the more beautiful you were perceived. And this was reflected not just in how you looked, but in your ability to participate in society's most exclusive circles. To achieve the ideal beauty standards, noble women and men would use various cosmetics. For women, pale skin was the goal, so they would cover their faces with white powders, sometimes made of lead or arsenic, to attain that ethereal look. However, these products came with dangerous side effects, lead poisoning, and other health problems. Some women would even go so far as to cover their entire bodies in these substances to keep their skin as pale as possible. A practice that eventually led to a number of tragic health consequences. Meanwhile, men's beauty standards focused on physical strength and nobility. The ideal man was one who appeared to be robust and healthy, often sporting a well-groomed beard and hair. Chivalric ideals, which celebrated the noble knight, demanded that a man's appearance reflect his readiness for battle, his honor, and his station in life. Handsome knights were not just handsome for the sake of beauty. They were seen as embodiments of virtue and strength. A knight who looked weak or sickly could face ridicule or diminished reputation. This was particularly true in the courts, where beauty was also tied to political power. The most physically attractive individuals, especially those in positions of power, were often considered more capable, intelligent, and influential, even if this perception wasn't entirely based in reality. So, in the world of medieval politics, beauty could quite literally be a weapon. For example, a noblewoman's beauty could secure political alliances through marriage, and a powerful monarch might use his attractiveness to strengthen his position in the eyes of his court and the people. Historians still argue whether beauty standards, as we understand them, were universally applicable across medieval society, or if they were a regional phenomenon shaped by geography, economy, and politics. In some areas, beauty ideals were strongly influenced by the church, while in others, they were driven by the ruling elite's desire to distinguish themselves from the common folk. Some scholars suggest that beauty ideals were a form of social control, a way to encourage people to aspire to the wealth and lifestyle of the elite. Others argue that beauty ideals were simply a reflection of the times, a natural outgrowth of medieval notions of purity, virtue, and divine favor. What we can say for certain, though, is that beauty in medieval times was tied to status, wealth, and power. It was not just about how you looked. It was about what your appearance said about who you were and where you stood in society. For the peasants, beauty was about surviving and staying healthy. For the wealthy, beauty was an assertion of status, a way to signal their place at the top of the social hierarchy. Yet, regardless of your social class, beauty was something that could affect your future. If you didn't meet the standards, you were often left out of the social and political games that defined medieval life. A peasant's appearance could determine whether they got a chance at marriage, while a noblewoman's beauty could determine her place in the court. In a society where power and appearances were so intertwined, beauty was not just skin deep, it was a way of determining worth, influence, and social standing. Now that we've explored the social and political implications of beauty in medieval times, let's shift gears a bit and take a look at some of the more bizarre, sometimes downright dangerous beauty practices that were in vogue during this era. Yes, medieval beauty standards weren't just about maintaining pale skin and shining hair. No, they also involved some rather peculiar rituals that could, at best, be considered unorthodox and, at worst, hazardous to one's health. Imagine you're in the court of a medieval noblewoman, surrounded by candles and expensive perfumes. She's preparing herself for a ball or a high-profile event, and the air is thick with the scent of flowers and incense. But what you might not notice, hidden behind the curtains or under layers of rich clothing, is that she's probably applying substances to her face and body that would make modern beauty experts cringe. You see, many beauty products in the medieval world were created with ingredients that were, well, let's just say, questionable by today's standards. One of the most infamous of these beauty treatments was the use of lead-based makeup. Lead was used in face powders and cosmetics to achieve that desirable, pale complexion that denoted nobility. It was often applied directly to the face and neck, and some women even went so far as to apply it to their entire bodies. The lead-based powders gave the skin a luminous, flawless finish, but the consequences were far from glamorous. Chronic exposure to lead could lead to poisoning, hair loss, and skin discoloration, not to mention a range of more severe health issues, including death. Yet, for many women in medieval society, the risk was worth it in the pursuit of beauty. Another popular but dangerous beauty treatment involved the use of mercury. Mercury was sometimes used in the preparation of creams and ointments meant to lighten the skin or treat blemishes. It was also used in some medicinal treatments, but mercury exposure is highly toxic and can cause irreversible damage to the nervous system. Imagine the irony, treating a skin blemish with a substance that could ultimately damage the very body it was supposed to heal. But once again, in an age where beauty was equated with divine favor and social power, people were willing to take these extraordinary risks to conform to the standards of the time. But the medieval pursuit of beauty didn't just stop at toxic substances. The methods for achieving the perfect, aristocratic appearance were also invasive in other ways. Take, for instance, the practice of hair removal. Medieval women, especially in the courts of Europe, were expected to have perfectly smooth, hairless faces and bodies. To achieve this, many turned to rather painful methods, such as plucking or even using hot wax to remove unwanted hair. The idea of a smooth, hairless body was tied to purity and femininity, and anything less was seen as undesirable or even unclean. In addition to these dangerous and painful beauty rituals, there were also more, shall we say, unusual practices aimed at perfecting the human form. One such practice involved the use of tight-laced corsets, designed to shape and compress the waist. While these garments were primarily used by women in the higher echelons of society to create a more dramatic silhouette, they often caused physical harm. Tight lacing could lead to breathing problems, internal organ damage, and even broken ribs. Yet, for many women, the corset was an essential part of their wardrobe, a fashion statement that showcased their status and adherence to beauty standards. The tighter the corset, the more defined the waist, and the more alluring the woman appeared to be in the eyes of society. Historians still debate whether these dangerous beauty practices were driven more by societal pressures or by personal vanity. Some argue that women of the time, especially in the upper classes, were simply doing what was expected of them, adhering to beauty standards set by the ruling elite. Others believe that these beauty rituals were a reflection of the deep-rooted cultural and religious beliefs about purity, femininity, and divine favor. Either way, one thing is clear. In the medieval world, beauty was more than skin deep. It was an all-encompassing pursuit, one that involved a combination of personal sacrifice, social expectations, and, often, a heavy toll on health. At the same time, it's important to note that beauty in the medieval world wasn't just a matter of physical appearance. It was also a reflection of one's character and morals. A woman's beauty was seen as an extension of her virtues, and a beautiful woman was often considered virtuous by society. But this wasn't just about physical attractiveness. Women were also judged by their ability to embody ideal qualities such as modesty, piety, and chastity. A beautiful woman in medieval society was expected to be more than just a pretty face. She had to embody the values of the time. And if she didn't, well, she was often regarded with suspicion, as her beauty could be seen as a sign of sinful vanity or improper behavior. In a world where survival depended on your status, and your status was often determined by how others perceived you, beauty became a powerful tool of both social mobility and control. For some, beauty was an asset to be cherished and used to their advantage. For others, it was a burden that required constant upkeep, with little room for deviation from the ideal. Yet, despite the dangers, pain, and social pressure that came with medieval beauty practices, they were ultimately a way for individuals to participate in the larger cultural and political landscape of the time, ensuring their place in a world that was deeply concerned with appearances. As we continue exploring the peculiar and sometimes dangerous beauty practices of the medieval period, it's important to look at how beauty was deeply tied to social class. The aristocracy and the nobility had the resources to access the most luxurious and hazardous beauty treatments, while peasants, although often more practical in their beauty habits, still faced their own set of expectations and challenges regarding appearance. The sharp divide between the classes meant that the pursuit of beauty was not only a personal journey, but also a reflection of one's place in society. Imagine yourself now in the midst of a bustling medieval town, walking through narrow cobbled streets, where the peasants and common folk bustle about their daily lives. Here, beauty standards weren't as elaborate as they were in the royal courts. But that doesn't mean the common folk didn't have their own rituals. For peasants, looking presentable was a matter of survival rather than luxury. The cleanliness of one's skin and the state of one's hair were important not just for aesthetic reasons, but for health and social acceptance. While the nobility could indulge in opulent baths and cosmetics, the average peasant had to be more resourceful. Water was a valuable commodity, and personal hygiene often took a back seat to the harsher realities of medieval life. For the common people, cleanliness could be a matter of life and death, with diseases like the plague and leprosy sweeping through Europe. To avoid these afflictions, peasants had to rely on simple methods to maintain a clean appearance. Many would use herbs and flowers to wash and scent their skin. Though there was no escaping the basic reality, regular bathing was a luxury few could afford. Historians still debate how the poor managed to keep up with the ever-present demands of hygiene and beauty, given the lack of resources. Some scholars believe that there was a belief in the spiritual value of cleanliness, which may have motivated peasants to use whatever means they could to maintain their appearance. Others suggest that, in an era when being visibly dirty could be seen as a sign of moral failing, peasants may have turned to natural resources like ashes, herbs, and vinegar to clean their bodies. Yet, even among the common folk, appearance was tied to social standing. A peasant might not have access to a fine lead-based powder or olive oil, but they knew the value of a clean, neat appearance. A well-groomed peasant was far more likely to be accepted in society, and cleanliness could even improve one's prospects for marriage. Appearance mattered in every class, but for the common folk, the rituals were less about indulgence and more about maintaining dignity and health. On the other hand, for those who could afford to indulge in medieval beauty practices, there was no shortage of dangerous and strange treatments to ensure that they met the beauty standards of the time. We've already explored some of the lead and mercury-based cosmetics, but these were just the tip of the iceberg. Noble women often went to great lengths to maintain their beauty, enduring pain and risk for the sake of meeting the standards of their time. A particularly bizarre beauty practice that was common in the medieval courts involved using bird droppings as a facial mask. Yes, you heard that right. The bird droppings, usually from nightingales, were believed to have powerful exfoliating properties. These droppings were cleaned, processed, and applied to the face to remove dead skin cells and improve the complexion. Imagine the feeling of bird droppings on your skin, left there for several minutes before being washed off to reveal radiant skin. While it may sound like an early form of torture, some medieval aristocrats swore by the treatment. Another notorious beauty treatment involved the use of a beauty spot, those small, dark marks that were often painted on the faces of noble women. These marks were seen as a sign of elegance, much like the modern beauty mark. However, the paint used for these marks was often made from a mixture of soot and various toxic chemicals. Women who used beauty spots to enhance their appearance were constantly exposed to these substances, which could cause skin damage and even poisoning over time. The need to look good, even at the risk of their health, was a constant theme in the pursuit of beauty among the nobility. For women of the royal courts, beauty was often a means of survival in its own right. In a world where marriage and alliances were often based on appearance and family reputation, women were expected to maintain an impeccable image, not just for personal satisfaction, but as a political necessity. A beautiful woman was more than just a well-loved figure in the court. She could be a symbol of the wealth, power, and social standing of her family. Every time she appeared in public, her beauty became a reflection of her family's status, and her appearance was crucial to ensuring that those political alliances remained intact. The constant pressure to maintain beauty in this high-stakes environment meant that women had little choice but to endure potentially harmful practices. One such practice, which was also common in the royal courts, involved the use of extremely tight clothing, including corsets, to create an impossibly small waist. Corsets were often worn so tightly that women's ribs could be compressed, leading to long-term health issues. But the desire for a small, perfectly shaped waist, an indicator of beauty and high status, was so strong that these women continued to wear the garments despite the discomfort and physical harm they caused. So, while many of these beauty practices were purely a reflection of the desires to look attractive and youthful, they were also, for many, tools of social positioning and political advantage. Whether in the courts of the nobility or among the common folk, beauty was much more than an aesthetic pursuit. It was a key element of survival, status, and power. Historians still debate the exact role of beauty in medieval society. Was it mostly about vanity? Or was it deeply tied to the power dynamics of the time? Either way, the strange and sometimes dangerous rituals people practiced to achieve beauty left a lasting mark on history. Let's shift gears now and look at how beauty standards in medieval times also had profound effects on one's health. Back in the day, your outward appearance often indicated how healthy you were. Or at least, that's how people thought. There was a direct link between how well-maintained your skin, body, and hair were and how healthy others assumed you to be. In medieval Europe, much like in earlier civilizations, maintaining a youthful and radiant appearance was tied to the concept of balance, both physical and spiritual. For the aristocracy, looking well-fed and healthy was a status symbol. It wasn't just about looking pretty or attractive. It was about showing that you had access to food, rest, and all the luxuries that life had to offer. In stark contrast, the poor were often regarded as dirty or unhealthy, simply because they couldn't maintain such polished appearances. The upper classes, in turn, feared being associated with the poor, as it was believed that looking sickly could bring shame and potentially expose them to divine retribution. Now, imagine stepping into a grand medieval feast hall. The tables are groaning under the weight of roasted meats, fine wines, and fresh fruit. Candles flicker, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls as noblemen and women feast. Their faces painted with a delicate layer of white powder to mimic an alabaster complexion. Behind the lavish festivities, though, there's a darker reality to beauty. While the wealthier members of society had access to foods rich in oils, dairy, and meat to maintain their glow, they also had the misfortune of being born into a world where beauty could become dangerously tied to one's health. For the common folk, the story was different. Their health was closely tied to their ability to access food and clean water. Poor hygiene practices, combined with lack of access to adequate nutrition, meant that skin conditions, bad teeth, and other visible signs of illness were rampant. For peasants, beauty wasn't about perfection, but survival. Any blemish on their skin was more likely to be seen as a sign of sickness, not a mere cosmetic concern. And for them, catching a glimpse of a blemish or pockmark could be a reminder of the difficulties they faced in life. Historians still debate whether medieval people truly believed that their external appearance was a direct reflection of their internal health. Some scholars suggest that people in the medieval period were more attuned to how the body and appearance were interconnected, seeing beauty as a manifestation of good health and divine favor. On the other hand, some argue that beauty standards in medieval times were largely superficial and not necessarily tied to any deeper meaning beyond social appearance. But let's dig deeper into some of the practices that would affect one's health in the pursuit of beauty. For instance, in order to achieve that pale, unblemished skin, noble women would often resort to the dangerous practice of applying lead-based cosmetics, As we've mentioned before, these products, when used frequently, would lead to poisoning over time, causing hair loss, discolored skin, and, in some cases, even death. It's strange to think that something as simple as trying to look beautiful could be so damaging to the body. Now, let's not forget another deadly practice: tight lacing. For centuries, women in medieval Europe wore corsets to achieve a slim, hourglass figure. These garments were often tightened so much that they would compress the ribs, displacing organs and restricting movement. Not only were they uncomfortable, but the tightness of these garments could also make it difficult to breathe. Many women passed out from tight lacing, or worse, suffered from long-term health problems such as difficulty breathing, organ damage, and even broken ribs. Yet, despite the risk, the pursuit of the ideal body shape was seen as a symbol of beauty and nobility. Imagine, if you will, a medieval woman, ready for a grand court appearance. She stands before the mirror, pulling tightly on the strings of her corset to achieve the perfect silhouette. She can barely breathe. But she's told that her beauty is tied to how slim her waist is. So she continues to endure the pain. The pressures of beauty are not just physical. They're social and political as well. A woman's beauty could decide her standing in society, her eligibility for marriage, and ultimately her life's path. In contrast, for the men of the time, beauty was also tied to strength and virility, unlike the women, whose beauty was largely dependent on their appearance. Men's beauty was often tied to their ability to perform physical tasks, whether on the battlefield or in the royal court. The pursuit of muscular strength, while not as dangerous as the women's beauty standards, could lead to excessive exercise or overexertion, resulting in injury. Some scholars argue that men's beauty standards were less rigid than women's, yet they still contributed to the overall pressure of conformity. The obsession with appearance. Even in the male-dominated world of medieval politics and society, had profound effects on people's well-being. It wasn't just women who suffered for beauty. Men had their own set of beauty pressures to live up to as well. Historians still debate whether the medieval pursuit of physical beauty was truly about health and vitality, or if it was primarily an aesthetic goal. Some argue it was about status and political power, who could appear youthful, strong, and healthy enough to rule. Others suggest that beauty standards were deeply rooted in cultural ideas of what was good and pure, driving people to take dangerous steps to attain these ideals. Either way, beauty in the medieval world was a complicated, sometimes dangerous game. Whether it was the use of toxic powders, the tightness of corsets, or the pressure to look youthful and strong, the pursuit of a beauty could be a physically risky endeavor, one that could lead to long-term health problems or even death. Still, the fact remains that beauty was as much about status, survival, and power as it was about looking good. Now that we've explored the risks associated with the medieval pursuit of beauty, let's delve into the cultural and religious underpinnings of beauty standards in the Middle Ages. In a world governed by religion and societal expectations, beauty wasn't merely a personal pursuit. It was, in many ways, a reflection of divine favor. In medieval Europe, physical beauty, purity, and virtue were all deeply interconnected. The idea that your external appearance could reflect your spiritual and moral standing was a powerful one, and it influenced every aspect of medieval life. For the clergy and the nobility, beauty was often tied to ideas of holiness and divine approval. Think about it. The Church, which held immense sway over all aspects of medieval life, viewed beauty as a sign of spiritual grace. Religious figures often associated the Virgin Mary with purity, holiness, and beauty. In fact, depictions of the Virgin Mary in medieval art often highlighted her flawless features. Skin as smooth as alabaster, a gentle expression, and an overall air of serenity. This idea of divine beauty became deeply ingrained in medieval culture, influencing not only religious imagery, but also how people viewed beauty in their daily lives. As you imagine yourself in a medieval chapel, candlelight flickering on the stone walls, you see intricate paintings of Mary on the altar. Her face is calm and composed, glowing with the serene purity expected of the Mother of God. Her beauty is not just physical, it represents her divine status. It's easy to see how these images of purity would affect how medieval people thought about beauty in the real world. To be beautiful was not just to be attractive, it was to be virtuous and pure, worthy of divine favor. The influence of Christianity on beauty standards in the Middle Ages didn't stop at religious art. It also had a profound impact on women's beauty rituals. Women, in particular, were expected to embody the ideals of purity and chastity. Many medieval women, especially those of the upper classes, adhered to strict codes of modesty. Beauty was often achieved through subtlety, with modest clothing and simple hairstyles being the standard. Excessive ornamentation or too much makeup was frowned upon, as it was seen as a form of vanity that went against the humble ideals of the church. This idea of modest beauty wasn't limited to women alone. Men, too, were expected to embody a certain kind of purity and virtue in their appearance. However, the ideal of masculinity was more about strength, dignity, and power than delicate features. Knights, for example, were often depicted as strong and gallant, their armor gleaming and their faces serious, embodying both the physical and moral strength of the time. This kind of beauty was less about aesthetics and more about how one's outward appearance reflected their character and virtues. Historians still debate how deeply people in the Middle Ages truly believed that their external beauty was tied to their spiritual well-being. Some argue that these beauty standards were purely socially constructed, meant to reinforce moral and religious order in a world where spirituality was central to everyday life. Others suggest that medieval people truly believed in the divine nature of beauty, and that to look beautiful was to be closer to the divine. One fascinating aspect of these beauty standards was how they reflected the social stratification of medieval society. As we've discussed, beauty was often a marker of status. The nobility, with their access to wealth and luxury, could afford to maintain their beauty through elaborate rituals, cosmetics, and accessories. But for the common folk, beauty wasn't something they could easily attain. They had to rely on natural remedies, simple cleansers, and modest adornments. Their beauty was seen as more earthy, tied to the land and to their daily labor. Picture yourself as a peasant living in medieval times. You wake up before dawn to begin your day's work, toiling in the fields or tending to livestock. Your appearance, while important to you, isn't something that can be cultivated with luxurious oils or cosmetics. Instead, your beauty comes from a life spent outdoors, from your hard work and the healthy glow of someone who lives in harmony with nature. While you may not have the time or means to follow the latest beauty trends, your outward appearance still holds weight within your community, and you understand that how you look reflects your status and role in society. In contrast, the nobles of the time would have had access to luxurious ingredients and treatments. The rich women of medieval courts often bathed in rosewater, used honey and milk for their skin, and applied intricate cosmetics made from crushed gemstones and gold leaf. Their beauty was a reflection of their wealth and status, and their appearance was as carefully crafted as their political influence. As you imagine the nobility moving through their grand halls, you see them adorned with jewels and finery, their faces expertly made up to reflect their divine right to rule. But even for the nobles, beauty could be a dangerous thing. With all its power and symbolism, a beautiful woman or man in the Middle Ages wasn't always seen as a purely positive figure. Sometimes, beauty was viewed as a threat, especially when it was seen as a form of power that could influence men or manipulate situations. Beauty was often associated with temptation, seduction, and the potential for moral corruption. In fact, one of the most famous examples of this is the legend of the Fatal Beauty, where beautiful women were often portrayed as dangerous and deceitful, leading men astray. Cleopatra herself was often depicted as the epitome of this kind of beauty, charming, powerful, and capable of using her looks to manipulate rulers and politicians. Beauty, in the Middle Ages, wasn't just about looking good. It was about embodying social ideals, representing divine favor, and being a symbol of strength or purity. Your appearance could elevate your social standing, but it could also make you vulnerable to suspicion, envy, or accusation. It's clear that beauty in medieval times was a complex, multifaceted concept, filled with social, religious, and political meaning. As we slowly bring this journey through medieval beauty standards to a close, it's worth reflecting on the lasting impact these ideals had on the people of the time, and how they shaped beauty standards in later centuries. Beauty in medieval times wasn't just about looking good. It was deeply intertwined with religion, power, and morality. The way beauty was perceived and constructed in the Middle Ages laid the foundation for how we view beauty even today, albeit in a very different context. But let's take a step back and think about something else that's crucial to understanding medieval beauty standards: the role of religious beliefs. As we've seen, beauty was closely linked to the divine, particularly the idea of purity. Many medieval beauty practices were based on a belief that looking beautiful could help elevate your spiritual and moral standing. This notion of purity was strongly tied to the image of the Virgin Mary, often depicted with a flawless, glowing complexion. Her beauty was not just physical. It was a reflection of her purity and grace. It's no wonder that medieval women, particularly those from higher social classes, sought to embody this ideal of purity in their appearance. The Virgin Mary's image was, in many ways, the standard by which women were judged. As you envision the altars in medieval cathedrals, adorned with vibrant depictions of the Virgin, her face serene and perfect, you can understand how her image became a template for women striving for beauty. It wasn't just about personal vanity, it was about aligning oneself with spiritual ideals. Women of the time would often dress modestly, their faces often pale and untouched by makeup, reflecting the simplicity and purity associated with the Virgin. This pale complexion, symbolic of purity, became an emblem of a woman's moral and spiritual worth. Historians continue to argue over how much of medieval beauty was truly tied to these spiritual ideals versus societal pressures. Was beauty in the Middle Ages a genuine spiritual pursuit? Or was it a reflection of societal expectations imposed on women? Some scholars believe that the pursuit of beauty was more about conforming to these strict ideals of purity and virtue. Others suggest that women in the Middle Ages may have used their appearance to gain social power, particularly in the courtly settings where beauty was often intertwined with political influence. One thing that is clear is that beauty in medieval times wasn't just about superficial appearances. It was about conveying messages. Whether it was the power of a noblewoman using her beauty to assert her authority, or a commoner using cleanliness and simplicity to prove their worth. Beauty had a deeply significant role in social structures. In a time when outward appearances were closely tied to one's social status, beauty was a way to navigate the complex hierarchy of medieval society. Now, let's reflect for a moment on how these standards influenced the lives of those in medieval society. Women, especially in the higher echelons of society, would often have attendants to help them with their beauty routines. Imagine a noblewoman in her chamber, attended by servants who help her with her elaborate hair arrangements, applying fine cosmetics to her face. For the common folk, however, the standards of beauty were much more rudimentary. Beauty was often achieved through simple, natural means, taking care to keep the skin clear and clean, combing the hair, and wearing modest, practical clothing. The impact of these standards on daily life cannot be understated. For noblewomen, beauty was a key part of their identity and status. It was about more than just looking attractive. It was about representing divine grace, purity, and power. For peasants, it was about maintaining health and avoiding disease, with cleanliness serving as a sign of worth and dignity. In the end, the medieval beauty standards were a reflection of the complex societal and religious beliefs of the time. These standards were not merely about vanity or self-indulgence, but were deeply rooted in the spiritual and social fabric of medieval life. Beauty was a means of aligning oneself with divine favor, asserting one's place in society, and navigating the complex political and social structures of the time. As you drift off into sleep tonight, think about the beauty standards of the past, the delicate balance between societal expectations and personal identity. How different were they from our own perceptions of beauty today, yet, in many ways, these medieval ideals of beauty still influence how we view ourselves and others. Whether consciously or unconsciously, beauty, in its many forms, remains a powerful force in shaping our world, just as it shaped the lives of those in the Middle Ages.